It's my pleasure to kick off today's national briefing on equity. As I hope you've seen earlier this morning, President Biden signed a new executive order to further advance racial equity and support for underserved communities. The president has made equity and racial justice a day one priority for this administration. Literally on day one of his tenure, he signed his first executive order on equity. This historic mandate charged the entire federal government to tackle the challenges that generations of discrimination, exclusion, and disinvestment have caused for communities across our nation. We know, however, that the fight for equity, it's not a one-day project or a one-year project or a two-year project. As the president has said, it's a generational commitment. This work gets to the heart of our success as a nation. We're working to ensure that everyone, including rural communities, communities of color, tribal communities, LGBTQI+ individuals, people with disabilities, women and girls, first-generation Americans, and communities impacted by persistent poverty, has every opportunity to realize the promise of America. Despite what some politicians may say about equity efforts, the truth is, when we lift each other up, we all benefit. Under the first executive order on equity, President Biden tasked agencies with changing the way they do business, ensuring that equity is at the forefront of their work. It was a whole of government endeavor. Agencies assessed their high-impact services to uncover where systemic barriers to access may exist. Last April, 90 agencies used those findings to produce more than 300 new strategies to support underserved communities. These strategies include bold actions, such as working with states to expand postpartum coverage for a year after childbirth to address the maternal mortality crisis that disproportionately affects Black and Native women. It includes shifting the Environmental Protection Agency's civil rights enforcement from being complaint-driven to proactive to address and advance environmental justice. It means translating more of the Department of Justice's public safety programs into additional languages so that everyone can access vital information about law enforcement. It means providing better technical assistance to rural communities so farmers and ranchers can secure federal funding to sustain and grow their businesses. Agencies are also prioritizing equity in implementing new programs that invest in American communities under landmark legislation, including the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. To give you just a few examples, through these landmark laws, we're replacing poisonous lead pipes that go into 10 million homes and 400,000 schools and childcare centers, so every child in this country can drink clean water. We're replacing the nation's existing fleet of school buses with clean and zero-emission buses to ensure that cleaner and healthier air is available for our children and families. We're relieving debt obligations for tens of thousands of distressed farm loan borrowers and farmers who've experienced discrimination. We're deploying record investments to tribal nations and Native communities to provide affordable high-speed internet, safer roads and bridges, modern wastewater and sanitation systems, clean drinking water, reliable and affordable electricity, and programs for climate resilience and drought mitigation. We're closing long-standing loopholes that enabled for-profit colleges to aggressively target veterans and service members and low-income students. And we're conducting robust outreach to veterans, particularly veterans in underserved communities, to ensure that they know they are eligible for benefits and health care under the newly enacted PACT Act. Already, we've achieved the most equitable economic recovery in memory and created a record 12 million jobs, including 800,000 good-paying manufacturing jobs. We've brought down unemployment nationwide, and in particular for Black and Latino workers, for whom unemployment rates are now near 50-year lows. and we're keeping our foot on the gas. Equity remains a key priority for President Biden, and he reaffirmed his unwavering commitment to this equity mandate today with his second executive order on further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. This new executive order strengthens the administration's commitment to build an America in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. The executive order directs federal agencies to publish annual action plans about how each agency is leveraging all of its resources and programs to advance more equitable outcomes. In developing these action plans, the executive order directs agencies to engage regularly in consultation with underserved communities, especially those communities that face legacy exclusions in engaging with the federal government. The president's renewed mandate directs federal agencies to increase support for rural and urban communities alike to ensure that there's more equitable development in all of our communities. The executive order also recognizes the importance of fully delivering the promise of our civil rights laws by reinvigorating federal civil rights offices while preparing to address the emerging threats to civil rights posed by technology and algorithmic discrimination. It also directs agencies to strengthen their internal efforts on equity, establishing senior leadership teams to coordinate this whole of government mandate. And the executive order directs agencies to use the federal budget, regulations, and other important tools to advance equity for all communities. For example, it formalizes the president's goal of increasing the share of federal contracting dollars awarded to small disadvantaged businesses by 50% by the year 2025. All of this work matters deeply for communities across the country, and we're excited to continue implementing this equity mandate. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Shalonda Young, Director of the White House Office of Management and Budget.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'll call you Ambassador Rice on here, but you are indeed a friend, especially all the work you've done in the equity space. We all owe you a debt of gratitude, so thank you so much for your remarks. As you heard from Ambassador Rice, this work does not happen overnight. It doesn't even happen in the first half of a first term. It takes time. OMB is here to make sure that work started with the president's day one EO, and the work that will continue with this new EO gets done. As the president likes to say, we finished the job. As a member of the president's economic team, I've heard him speak many times about how we need to grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And this administration has acted accordingly. That's why, for example, we've seen Black and brown unemployment near historic lows. This did not happen by accident. And it's a result of this president's insistence that we must build an economy that works for all Americans. Today's EO is another tool we have to affect outcomes so that people feel it in communities that have often been left out or left behind. So today I want to tell you about just 3 of the many ways that OMB is making sure the president's equity agenda becomes a reality. First, we're continuing to advance equity in federal procurement. The federal government is the biggest purchaser of goods and services in the world, but only a small share of federal agencies' total eligible contracting dollars typically go to small disadvantaged businesses. Whether that is a woman-owned small business, service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, or minority-owned businesses, the president made a historic goal for small disadvantaged businesses to be awarded 15% of federal contract dollars by fiscal year 2025. And you heard Ambassador Rice speak to that. And OMB, the agency I lead, works with agencies to deliver on that promise. We will soon release guidance directing agencies to evaluate their progress in growing the diversity and resilience of their supplier base. And we'll also make sure that they have tools to get it done. We've created a new federal supplier-based dashboard that helps agencies identify where we need to attract new entrants. We also have a new tool so that agencies can identify small businesses that have registered to do business with federal agencies but have not yet received a contract award. With these new tools, agencies can continue to advance economic opportunities for all Americans, including underserved entrepreneurs and small business owners. Second, we're changing how the federal government serves the public. Getting the federal services you need should be easy. You shouldn't have to guess what three-letter agency to go visit and figure it out. That's not always the case. It is not always easy for people to find government services. Too often, people face a maze of agencies and websites and phone numbers, and it's often those who need those services the most who have the hardest time accessing them. That's why this administration has made improving service delivery a major priority from the very beginning. Here at OMB, we focused our efforts on the federal programs that touch the most Americans, have the highest volume of transactions a year, or have an outsized impact on the people we serve. Our team has been researching people's experiences, interacting with the government at 5 key life moments. Having a child, something I'm very familiar with, having a 16-month-old, recovering from a disaster, facing a financial shock, transitioning from active duty service to civilian life, and approaching retirement. We'll use that research to work with agencies to fix the challenges too many Americans face when trying to access the services they need. The last area of work I want to highlight is OMB's efforts to revise the standards that guide how federal data on race and ethnicity is collected and reported. Agencies must follow these standards when they are collecting data. And we know that data matters a great deal. What gets measured gets done. But these standards haven't been updated in roughly 25 years, and a lot has changed since then. That's why last summer, OMB launched a formal process to revise these standards so that they better reflect the diversity of the American people and the challenges and opportunities they face. Last month, a working group representing more than 20 federal agencies released an initial set of recommendations that would collect race and ethnicity together with a single question, add a response category for Middle Eastern and North African, among other things. These recommendations are not final. We want and need to hear from the public on these recommendations to make sure that we get it right. So I encourage you to get involved in the upcoming listening sessions and virtual town halls so we can hear your views and incorporate them into the process. In conclusion, Ambassador Rice and I often talked about how achieving equity is a generational undertaking. We've committed to doing this work. We are committed to doing this work, and in doing it so that it lasts long after any of us are in these seats and are in these offices. I want to thank Ambassador Rice for getting us together for this. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rice and Director Young, for leading us in today's discussion on the President's efforts to further advance racial equity and support for underserved communities. I'm Chirag Bains, Deputy Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council and Deputy Assistant to the President for Racial Justice and Equity. Over the past 2 years, agencies have undertaken historic work toward ensuring that federal programs are serving the American people in an equitable and just manner, and supporting communities that have been locked out of opportunity for too long. We're going to hear now from 3 equity champions within the administration who are helping to lead the work of federal agencies to advance racial justice and equity more broadly to support all underserved communities. Let's bring in our senior administration officials. I'm honored to introduce Deputy Secretary Julie Su from the Department of Labor, Deputy Secretary Adrian Todman from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Assistant Secretary Catherine Lehman from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. All 3 of your agencies play vital roles in advancing equity for the American people, at work, at school, in people's neighborhoods, and at home. Let's start with Deputy Secretary Todman. Deputy Secretary Todman, ensuring all communities can access safe and affordable housing is a bedrock part of achieving equity. But for so many communities, especially Black and Brown communities, discriminatory practices like redlining have resulted in residential segregation that is still pervasive today. And discriminatory practices have made it harder for communities of color to build intergenerational wealth through home ownership. How is HUD protecting communities that have long faced discrimination in our nation's housing market and advancing equity for renters and homeowners who face barriers?
Thank you so much, Chirag. It's great to see you and my fellow colleagues who are here. I'd like to first thank Ambassador Rice and Director Young for hosting this very important conversation today. You know, it's been an honor to serve in an administration that looks to history to help inform how we move forward. And it is under the leadership of our secretary here at the Department of Housing and Urban Development that we've been combating homelessness with urgency, expanding access to affordable housing opportunities, ensuring disaster recovery, closing the racial homeownership gap, and centering equity, and very specifically racial equity along the way. And let me tell you about that why. While Black people represent 13% of the US population, we make up about 40% of our homeless neighbors across America. The Fair Housing Act, which explicitly prohibits discrimination in housing and was signed into law in 1968, but the racial wealth gap is as big today as it was then. And people with low incomes and people of color are the least likely to be able to prepare for a storm as it arrives, and the least likely to be able to recover from one. You know, at HUD, we cannot do our work effectively without facing history and facing these facts. And over the past 2 years, we've taken several actions to that, and I want to share two with you briefly. First, the work that we have done in appraisal bias, and second, the work that we are doing to finally fully implement all the elements of the Fair Housing Act. I'll start with appraisal bias. 100 years ago, 100 years after the Tulsa race massacre in June of 21, President Biden and Vice President Harris established an interagency task force to take a hard look at appraisal bias and its impact. That task force is being led by our very own Secretary Fudge and Ambassador Rice. And you might say, why? Why this work? All things being equal, a house in a Black or brown neighborhood is appraised at roughly 20% less than one in a white neighborhood. The work over this past year brought together a robust team of cabinet level and independent agencies to speak in one voice and exact change under existing authorities so families of all backgrounds and all neighborhoods can have a better chance at building generational wealth. And less than a year after the task force was established, we sent to the president an action plan, not a thought plan, but an action plan that constitutes the most wide-ranging set of reforms ever to advance racial equity in the home appraisal process. And we didn't stop there. Every day we're working in earnest to deliver results together to empower consumers, make the appraisal industry more accountable, cultivate a well-trained and diverse appraisal workforce, and to make sure technology does not perpetuate bias. At HUD, we've made $28 million available to fund testing, education, and outreach efforts on communities on this issue. And further, we're working to give people who are seeking HUD mortgages, HUD mortgage financing, an avenue for recourse if they believe that their appraisal may have been skewed. And there's more information about this work that everyone here can find on our website. Second, I want to spend some time talking about the full promise of the Fair Housing Act, which is already the law of the land. The Fair Housing Act, for those of you who might not be aware, prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. It is HUD's job to enforce this law, which directs us to administer our programs and activities in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. This means that the federal government must take proactive and meaningful steps to overcome patterns of segregation, that we must promote fair housing choice, that we must eliminate disparities in housing-related opportunities, and we must foster inclusive communities free from discrimination. But this particular part of the Fair Housing Act, affirmatively furthering fair housing, has never, ever truly been actualized, although many have tried. But this administration has said, not on our watch. We are taking bold action to change this. Just recently, we published a new proposal that's going to charge local and state government entities to set ambitious goals to not only confront and reject housing discrimination in all of its forms, but recognize and act on the promise of the Fair Housing Act by leveraging HUD's funding to develop solutions that meet their unique needs. This proposal is the result of a deliberative and thoughtful engagement process, and we really, really want to hear from you on how we can make this rule even stronger and more bold to make sure that we are enforcing fair housing and being aspirational to take on housing discrimination that has impacted this country so severely over the several decades past. Look, the Secretary and I are looking forward to continuing our work with our colleagues across the federal government, but also our colleagues at state, local, nonprofits, housing agencies across the country to continue this hard and good work. And by this, I mean making sure that we are centering history, that we are centering the people impacted by our history, that we are centering our consumers, and we are centering those who really need our help the absolute most. It's my honor to continue this work and to work with folks like you, Chirag, and I can't wait to hear what my colleagues have to share.
Thank you very much, Adrienne, for taking us into this discussion. I'm struck by your comments about facing history. The president has often talked about that. You know, he often says the great nations don't hide from their history. They acknowledge their past, both the triumphs and the tragedies, and they do something about it. And your work is a testament to that. Thank you very much. Let me turn next to you, Deputy Secretary Sue, to pick up on some of these themes. For low-income families, especially families of color, there are deep disparities that persist in our labor market. You and I have discussed this before. It is what animates much of your work. Thanks to the president's work to lead an equitable economic recovery, we've brought unemployment rates to historic lows. That includes nearly the lowest levels in 50 years for workers of color. But we know that most underserved communities continue to face discrimination and real barriers to accessing good jobs with fair pay. How is DOL advancing equity for workers? And more than that, how should we confront the zero-sum thinking that if underserved communities have better jobs, that leaves fewer opportunities for others?
Thank you so much, Chirag, for bringing us all together today. And I'm just so grateful to work for a president and an administration that has made equity not just a goal, but a cause. And to be here with my friend, Deputy Secretary Todman, for all of your words. I just want to echo and build on them. And my dear friend and the amazing Assistant Secretary Lehman. So here at the Department of Labor, we're really laser focused every day on helping to fulfill the president's vision of an economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And what that means is we start with those who've been for too long at the bottom, where workers don't enjoy the basic promise of a just day's pay for a hard day's work, where they wake up in the morning unsure if they are going to return home at the end of the day safe and healthy, or where they're shut out of opportunities for good jobs altogether due to discrimination, occupational segregation, or other forms of marginalization. We can't build the economy that President Biden envisions if we don't fix those things. It's already been mentioned, the racial wealth gap in the US persists. In 2019, the median wealth for a white household was $184,000. For a Black household, it was $23,000. So a white family's wealth is 8 times higher than that of a Black family's. Closing this racial wealth gap is a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration, for Secretary Marty Walsh, for me, and for the entire Department of Labor, not just during Black History Month, but every month. The president's policies, which have resulted in some $2 trillion worth of investments in infrastructure, manufacturing, science, and our climate future, are game-changing. Ambassador Rice already talked about this. And the good jobs that are being created to repair roads and bridges, to lay down pipes for clean water, and to build electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations from coast to coast, to bring manufacturing home so that we're manufacturing microchips here in the United States, are transforming our economy. But we have to be intentional and vigilant about making sure that these are good jobs and that all Americans have access to these jobs. That's why we've been working really closely with our sister agencies the Departments of Transportation, Energy, and Commerce to embed job quality and equity standards in federal funding opportunities. Since the president's historic laws were signed, good jobs and equity have been included in nearly $100 billion in infrastructure spending alone. This is going to result in training programs with pathways, inclusive apprenticeships, with community college pre-apprenticeships, and other pathways with wraparound services so that all communities can get the good jobs that we're building. You asked this question, Chirag, how do we get away from the zero-sum mentality? And so all of this is not just a matter of being fair. It really is a matter of how to build a strong and resilient economy. There are lots of data about this, but in a 2019 McKinsey report estimated that if we closed the racial wealth gap for Black Americans, it could raise GDP by 4 to 6% by 2028. So I don't know how many economic policies could have that kind of outcome, but we know that ending structural racism is good economic policy. I also just wanted to talk about a couple other things that are in our Equity Act plan, Chirag, and one is about enforcement, making sure that that there's a floor under which no worker in this country should have to live and work. And what we learned from the pandemic is that workers who are the most essential are often those who work under the harshest conditions. And sadly, this work was and remains undervalued in part because of who performs this work. That's part of the structural racism that continues to persist and result in wage theft and other kinds of labor law violations. So we've really focused our enforcement resources on these industries, on these vulnerable workers. And we've also focused our rulemaking power on rules that will impact low-wage, vulnerable workers in underserved communities. So for example, we have a rule for tipped workers who are disproportionately women and workers of color to make sure that they don't have their tips unfairly taken by their employer and that they are receiving full wages for the work that they're doing. President Biden issued an executive order that went into effect in January of last year that ensures that no workers who are on covered government contracts would be paid less than $15 an hour. And that EO increases earnings growth for workers who are historically at the bottom of the income distribution. And such gains have been shown to reap benefits for years, as you all have already said, and as Deputy Secretary Todman mentioned, like these have intergenerational impacts. And many of the contracts covered by the rule are in industries where the workforce is largely comprised of women and people of color. In fact, half of the workers impacted by that minimum wage EO are Black or Latino, and they will receive the largest pay increases, taking a much needed step to address racial income inequality. This is what President Biden is saying about building an economy that leaves no one behind, and the Department of Labor is working to deliver on that day. Finally, I talked about equity in terms of who gets good jobs and also equity in terms of who is affected when we lift the floor for all workers. But we also need a strong safety net for workers for when they're no longer working, whether that's retirement or when they're injured or when they're unemployed. And so we are also investing money in equity grants to states to fix the unemployment insurance system to make sure that those who've been left out of it or don't feel like they can access it, to provide navigator grants so that community organizations who are most trusted on the ground by working people and communities of color can actually be the ones who help them navigate the unemployment insurance system. And so from the safety net to the jobs that people have to the jobs that people could have, we're really focused on delivering equity.
Thank you, Julie. You covered a lot of ground there. I especially appreciate what you said about the floor and lifting the floor. When we lift each other up, we're all lifted up. And that is definitely at the heart of the president's executive order today. You also talked about enforcement. And so I'm thrilled to turn next to Assistant Secretary Catherine Lehman, who leads enforcement of the civil rights statutes that the Department of Education has jurisdiction over, to talk about the critical role that civil rights has to play in our equity and racial justice mandate. The EO signed this morning by the president has a section in it that specifically directs agencies to elevate their civil rights offices, properly resource them, and prioritize enforcement work. It directs agencies to address emerging civil rights threats like algorithmic discrimination to ensure that civil rights are protected in this increasingly digital world. Assistant Secretary Lehman, can you reflect on the progress we've made on civil rights in the last 2 years in this administration, and also on the work that lies ahead?
Thanks so much, Chirag, and I'll also just echo my colleagues' thanks and gratitude for the work of this panel and for bringing us together for this conversation. I'll just say first how thrilling it is to watch the reinvigoration of federal civil rights enforcement across agencies during the first 2 years of this administration already. I think it's a resounding success. It's so important for the country, and it's been such a delight to get to watch the right sizing of rules and practices, increasing staffing for civil rights enforcement offices, training and encouraging staff to use all of our authorities to maximize our impact, the active collaboration across the civil rights offices and the agencies to share best practices and encourage each other. That's been my favorite part. And then I want to talk specifically about the Department of Education, where I lead the Office for Civil Rights. And our goal has been, in these 2 years, will continue to be transparent, efficient, and effective. So we want to share our message. We want to make sure that we are moving as fast as we can to get as much redress as school communities need. We want to be as effective as we possibly can. So toward that end, we've revised our complaint processing manual. We built a new tool for speedier relief for complainants who seek that tool and can use it. We've increased our outreach. We've tried to be more inclusive with school communities, with parents and families, to make sure that we have information about what they need and that they have information about their rights and what Congress has promised for students in schools. We're offering information to school communities about how the law applies. We're clarifying timely issues such as how we work to redress anti-Semitism in schools and when and how it is permissible to address systemic racism. We're working to close older cases while keeping pace, remaining current with the new ones that are coming in. We're sharing staff training across all of our offices. We have 12 offices around the country for emerging civil rights issues in the pandemic context and otherwise. And we're addressing persisting discrimination to encourage school communities to examine their practices and correct them. I want to tell you just 2 examples of our successes in enforcement work. One is sort of new and horrible, and another is the kind that we've seen over time and time again. The sort of new and horrible one was when we found a school community that required students with disabilities to wear different colored shirts than all the other students in the school, singling them out, separating them, identifying them as students with disabilities, just was sort of a scarlet A for them at school. We ended that practice very, very quickly to make sure that the school communities could be fully inclusive for all students, and we didn't segregate and distinguish kids with disabilities because of who they are. Separately, we just recently last summer resolved an investigation of longstanding racially disparate discipline in a California school district. It's a kind of discrimination that we've seen over a pattern over years in this particular district across every type of discipline, across the schools, across grade levels. The district was imposing greater harms on Black students than their white peers, and that had happened over years. We're very pleased that the district volunteered to enter into a resolution agreement. It's working with us now to try to address that moving forward. But that's the kind of work that we've seen over time. And I'm really excited that my agency and across federal government, we're back to doing it in the right way. I think today's executive order specifically emphasizes the positions for the government to build on that success that we've had so far with these important practices, so that we now as a country fulfill Congress's longstanding promise to the nation that the federal government will be a backstop against harm. And I'm so excited about the work that is to move forward that we're all charged with doing today. And I am ready. I know my colleagues across all of the civil rights offices in government stand equally ready.
Thanks, Catherine. You are clearly a vigorous guardian of the civil rights of the nation's students. And that kind of enthusiasm is I think, what the president is looking for and directing across the administration with this executive order today. Well, these have been extremely helpful comments. And I want to just try to make this concrete for folks. Sometimes people, even more concrete, sometimes people feel, and I myself feel, that there are a lot of words, and sometimes these concepts can be abstract. But it's anything but abstract, what we're talking about today. We're talking about an impact in people's lives. We're talking about the opportunity to thrive, real, true equal opportunity in education, in housing, in the economy. And you all travel the country. You talk to people on the ground. You are working on cases that impact people very directly. I wonder if you might just share with us, in the brief time that we have, because we're running a little behind, but if you might share with us a story of one American you've met whose life has been impacted by the fact that the president prioritized equity on day one. And with that, I'll start with Deputy Secretary Todman. Deputy Secretary Todman, you are on mute still.
Oh, my apologies. You would think I'd know by now, but so I'll go quickly. I know we are short in time. I was recently in Seattle, and where many folks across the country, particularly those in Seattle, know is encountering a fairly intense homelessness crisis right now. And as I mentioned before, disproportionately, many people who are homeless are Black and Brown. But while I was there, I was fortunate to encounter a very special group of people that's been brought together by the colleagues we work with in Seattle and King County. And it was individuals who are formerly homeless, and they were part of a lived experience coalition. And this was 2 Black women and 1 brother. And they were, really thrilled to be able to take the things that they had learned and endured as our homeless neighbors to bring it to the table in solution making for how to really present and use HUD's funds to make sure that others that look like them, who are homeless as they once were, to be able to make those solutions in a really practical way. And that would not have happened without the centering of equity, the deploying of HUD's technical assistance, and quite frankly, the use of HUD's funds in American Rescue Plan to get people housed. And I know we're short on time, but one last thing. I was in Puerto Rico, where many people may not know that Puerto Rico very unfairly did not have access to their disaster recovery funds until this administration was what came into place. And while I was there, I was able to visit with a senior gentleman who was telling me about how horrific Hurricane Maria was for him. And I held his hand, and he was so happy to know that someone, from the US, someone from the Biden administration was there and who cared, and who finally allowed the Puerto Ricans who had suffered so much through that hurricane and other storms since then, finally had access to the disaster recovery funds that they were due. I mean, if nothing says this administration has made an impact between these African Americans in Seattle who are teaching and learning at the same time, to this Latino gentleman in Puerto Rico who finally had a home, it was a blessing to experience and makes me proud to be part of this Biden team.
Thank you, Adrienne. That's very powerful and very concrete. Let me turn next to Deputy Secretary Sue.
Okay, Chirag, so I don't know which one to talk about. The worker who got a healthcare benefit that they needed, or who took medical leave, and was not fired from their job, or the resilience workers that the secretary and I met with at a parking lot in New Orleans, who are the people who chase disasters and do cleanup afterwards, and are often not paid for that work, or teachers who were talking about what it was like to get them through the pandemic. But I will talk about a farm worker, because we know that farm workers have not only carried us through the pandemic and hard times, but continue to be the ones who put food on our tables. And this is a farm worker, a Black farm worker in Sunflower County, Mississippi, where employers have abused the H-2A system to bring in white workers from South Africa to replace the Black workers. And the H-2A program exists to allow employers to hire foreign workers only when US workers are not available. And so this Black farm worker was a 3rd-generation farm worker, and who had lost a job, and then who reported rampant wage theft on the farms. And so as a result of this administration's focus on equity, the Department of Labor has, for the first time ever, investigators in the Mississippi Delta. We know that we need to be where workers need us the most. And so we were able to do an investigation. We were able to collect back wages. This farm worker said that he used the money to pay basic house bills, which, when the president talks about people needing breathing room, we know that for many low-wage workers, that is a luxury they do not yet have. And following this effort, we also learned that Black farm workers in the Mississippi Delta received a raise to $12.45 an hour without any explanation. So we would like to believe that our focus on equity, that when the federal government demonstrates that we are on the side of hardworking working people, that we can make a difference, and he's an example of that.
Thanks, Julie. Working people are the backbone of this country, and we appreciate all you're doing to make sure that every one of them has a good job, fair wages, and fair working conditions. Deputy Assistant Secretary Lehman, I'll turn it to you to close us out.
Great. Well, like my colleagues, I'm going to fight the hypothetical a little bit and give you two stories, but I'll be fast. So one is just picking examples from recent resolution agreements. Just in December, we resolved a race harassment investigation of a school district in Iowa. This is a district that is pretty isolated for the Black students. There are only 6% Black students there. And there was a Black middle schooler who had suffered very distressing harassment, ugly racial epithets, ugly slurs used to mock him over a 2-school-year period. And the school had been insufficiently responsive. They took some action, but they didn't recognize some of the behavior as bullying and harassment. When they held, for example, a restorative circle for students, they didn't reference the specific slurs that the student had experienced or instruct students about necessary steps to stop the harassment. So I was so grateful that we were able to be there for this student in middle school who had been reduced to tears in class by his experience, and to have him know that the federal government had his back, and to help him, to help his school community to heal and to move forward and to end that racial harassment in what was otherwise a pretty racially isolated district. And then just last month, we resolved a pregnancy discrimination investigation of a university in Alabama. And there, the student had notified her university before the semester began that she was pregnant. And she received sort of ad hoc, uncoordinated responses from the school. For example, when she became so pregnant that she couldn't fit into a classroom desk, she requested a table and she never received one. When one of her instructors requested guidance about how to accommodate her, the instructor never received any guidance from school. So she was unable to get what she needed and to pursue her dreams as a pregnant student in school. This is what she told us when we resolved the investigation, helped her and helped the school community to heal. She said she is so thankful that future students at the university will have fair treatment and better policies in place for them, along with the staff training. She said, I can't thank you enough for helping me with bringing awareness to the issues I was facing, and I'm forever grateful I had someone in my corner. And I will say, I am forever grateful to be in the corner for every student who needs us, for every issue in every school all over the country.
Well, Catherine, if that doesn't bring it home, I don't know what does. Thank you for being so concrete. Thank you all for your participation in today's panel. We know that equity is not a 1-year or a 2-year project. It's a generational project. It's a generational commitment. And we thank you for your work across the administration to make this real for Americans across the country. Thanks very much. We'll move now to our next panel. While ensuring racial equity and support for underserved communities takes a whole of government approach, it takes more than that. We can't do this work effectively without deep partnerships across our country with the communities that are directly impacted by the government's work. That's why the president's new executive order, signed this morning, directs federal agencies to deepen their partnerships with underserved communities as they develop equity action plans that contain specific strategies to make concrete what it means to deliver equity for all Americans. I'm pleased to be joined by 3 equity champions from across the country who are at the forefront of grassroots and national movements for equity. Marlene Sayo is Executive Director of the National Disability Rights Network, a nonprofit organization that works to advance equity for people with disabilities. Lorette Picciano is Executive Director of the Rural Coalition, an alliance of more than 70 culturally diverse community-based organizations representing small producers and farm workers across the country. And Ron Busby is President and CEO of U.S. Black Chambers, an organization that advances economic empowerment for African-American entrepreneurs and Black businesses across America. Thank you all for joining us. Let's jump into this. Marlene, the first question will be for you. The EO released today directs the federal government to advance equity for the many communities defined very broadly who have faced and continue to face discrimination and disinvestment. That includes people with disabilities. As a disability rights advocate and an advocate for racial justice, talk to me about how the president's equity mandate has impacted your advocacy work with the federal government and with other partners. Why is it so important to see disability justice interwoven into our broader equity and racial justice charge?
Thank you so much, Chirag, and thank you for having us here today. I wanted to say that I'm very grateful to the Biden-Harris administration for taking the necessary steps to make our country more inclusive, accessible, and equitable for people with disabilities, including myself. I'm a Latina, Afro-Latina at that. I have an invisible disability, and I am an immigrant. And for far too long, individuals like myself and others have been excluded from the table during the decision-making process. We've had to push to ensure that solutions to issues such as access to affordable housing or access to the polls included and addressed our needs in an equitable and just fashion. And we have often been an afterthought, if any, during the decision-making process. But this administration has actually adopted a whole of government approach, which has allowed us within the disability community to be part of the decision-making discussions and processes being put in place by a lot of the federal agencies currently. I myself have been invited to many conversations, and this has allowed me to also collaborate with other agencies in the community, both civil rights and disability rights, to address these needs. And I want to say that some great civil rights leaders, like the ones that we heard from today, Deputy Secretary Lehman and Deputy Secretary Todman, are continuously striving to advance civil rights and ensure that the rights of people with disabilities, including our youth with disabilities, are being protected. And I feel that our concerns are being acknowledged, and there has been positive movement. For instance, we saw a big push by the administration to ensure that communities of color in the disability community had access to COVID-19 testing and vaccinations. The administration proposed to phase out the subminimum wage provision in Section 14 of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And time again, the Department of Education has fought for the civil rights of students with disabilities during COVID and beyond. And so I believe that this administration realizes that the disability community is not monolithic, that we are unique and essential. And it also recognizes that each and every one of us in the disability community has strengths and needs that must be met, and that we are a very powerful community.
Undoubtedly. Thank you, Marlene, for sharing those thoughts. Laurette, let me turn to you next. Ensuring investment and support in rural communities is a core part of the administration's equity mandate. This new EO calls for agencies to expand economic opportunities in rural communities. There is a specific provision about that. It also directs agencies to expand their engagement with the communities that are most directly impacted. And again, that includes rural communities. Rural communities have long faced disinvestment, and as agencies move forward with their action plans, I'd love to hear, how do you think they can best ensure that federal policy development is responsive to the lived experience and needs of rural and underserved communities?
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and really believe that the Domestic Policy Council is a really important entity. One of the things that needs to happen with policy is to make sure that rural communities, that somebody is listening to them and understands their value and their act and ability and capacity to do things. We applied to do a vaccine outreach program with Rural Coalition, 15 of our member groups, and a shared project with the National Alliance of Farm Worker Women. And we received 100% score and had a $7 million investment where we said, we can do this best together in the networks that we have created. And when the government sees us, we were able to go out with half of the money and 15 groups to do 1,000 events and, document at least 70,000 vaccines in some of the poorest and most, community vulnerable communities. And it was the first time we used data to map who we represented, which were, if you use the CDC Vulnerability Index, these are the most vulnerable rural communities. So we know how to do it. And this administration has seen us. We've also talked about definitions and data. We've worked on all of the discrimination lawsuits against the Department of Agriculture over all these years. We've worked on all of the definitions in federal law on equity. And finally, in these executive orders, we're seeing a reflection back that those things are important. Of course, we're in a harder territory. We wake up one day and we find out that the America First Foundation and all of these other groups are litigating against the debt relief to Black, Indigenous, people of color farmers. So we also know those definitions are also under threat, and equity is going to be harder to achieve than ever. But we signed up, and we will be giving the best, and we already have given the best of our recommendations and how to roll out the $2 billion in discrimination relief to the producers. And for you to recognize that we have an infrastructure, a lot of times administrations go to the usual suspects. And what they're missing is not only the community-based organization, but the networks. And so like if you say, okay, let's define a persistently poor community and let's put money there to do waters and sewers, what we've seen that happens is there's still a rich side of town in the poor communities. And unless you engage the community-based organizations, you're going to get the new water systems only on one side of town, and the water costs are going to go up for everybody. So, what we really, really want to bring is our knowledge and experience, and to be connected so that we can give the best policy advice. And, this is the first administration that's seen us in the way you've seen us, but also invested. Our communities do not lack capacity. What they lack is investment. They know how to do all these things, but you need to have a community. You need to have somebody who can manage the finances and sign out with, grants.gov and do all of those things. And what we found is when you fund all of us together, we can move a lot faster, and we keep on learning from each other. So, those are a few of the thoughts that we can share, but learning community-based organizations has been really, really important. And we're going to be here to be working with you, because there's a lot of federal investments that we know are one-time only. And how can we use that to build, remembering our organizations are our technology, and our networks are our infrastructure.
Well, thank you, Lorette, for your leadership. And what you said about going to the usual suspects when shaping government policy is really resonated with me. This work, this equity work, is ultimately about democracy. Does this country work? Our government should be responsive to the people. That means all of the people, not just those with the resources or relationships to get their voices heard. And that's a big through line for this executive order. Ron, let me turn to you next. You are a national leader in the work to build wealth for Black Americans. And one of the anchors of the administration's equity work is closing the racial wealth gap, which Deputy Secretary Seuss spoke about earlier. That includes by using the power of federal procurement, the federal spend, to ensure that more small, disadvantaged, and minority-owned businesses can tap into the contracting marketplace and grow intergenerational wealth by starting and building and growing small businesses. Talk to me about why equitable procurement is such a powerful tool for closing the racial wealth gap from your perspective.
Well, first, I'd like to thank all of you for being here this afternoon. This is truly an honor for the U.S. Black Chamber to participate in this conversation. For years, we've been talking about the racial wealth gap between minority communities, particularly Black communities and white communities. And we applaud the Biden-Harris administration for taking steps to address it through this new policy, especially around Section 7. The federal government is the largest purchaser of products and services in the world. And when we can use that leverage to really be able to address equity in our communities, we all win, particularly those disadvantaged and underserved communities. If you look at $960 billion of spend, if we can make sure that those dollars are reaching the communities that need it the most, we can impact those communities right off the bat. The U.S. Black Chamber is really around three things as we look at this administration. The first one being intentionality. We believe that in order for there to be real racial gap equity, we've got to make sure that we're looking at the communities that are impacted the most. And for this conversation, it's really around how can we address Black communities. And so we've got to make sure that we're addressing Black issues and Black contracts. The second one is really around transparency. And we really want to be able to see where those dollars are being spent, how those dollars and contracts are being awarded. And for the President of the United States and the Vice President to come out and say, we really want to address equity by contracting intentionally, that gives us all hope. We know that at the U.S. Black Chamber, the fastest way to be able to create wealth in our community is by being able to start new businesses. And so this contracting opportunity the federal government is looking at really gives us a positive look into the future. We know that we've started more new Black-owned businesses over the last 2 years since this administration has been in. Now we've just got to be more accountable to how those businesses are being addressed, how those contracts are being awarded, and what the impacts are having for our communities, our families, and most importantly, our businesses. This is a really important time and conversation for our businesses and our chambers across the country. And so we are really excited about the future of working with this administration. One of the things that we saw is that when you include organizations like ours, policies can be addressed. When the virus first hit, we saw the payroll protection plan did not really address Black-owned businesses. It was really for those employees. And in our community, we have 3.2 million Black firms, but 3.1 million had no employees. And when we have relationships and when we have a seat at the table, we can really have conversations about how to fix policy immediately so that we can fix our communities, our businesses, as well as the American country.
Thank you, Ron. That is a call to action to all of us. And I appreciate you mentioning the growth of small businesses. 10 million small businesses have been created. New businesses have been created just in the last 2 years, and that growth is disproportionately Black and Brown owned businesses, small businesses of the sort that you were describing. I want to ask one final question to each of you, and I'd ask you to keep this answer brief as we are a little bit behind schedule here. The president has issued this renewed and deepened equity mandate across the administration. As movement leaders, organizers, equity advocates, what is the call to action that you would make to communities, to organizations, perhaps the private sector, to work in partnership with and support the federal government's work to lift up underserved communities and ensure that this country works for everyone? I'll go in reverse order here and start with you, Ron.
Well, I think we're seeing it today. Our organizations, like many across the country, really have those relationships in those communities that have historically been left out, been underutilized, and we call them many times underserved communities. But the folk that are on this call have national relationships. Not only are we experts in what we do in reference to policy creation, but we have the expertise in reference to knowing what the cultural challenges are. We are also very business oriented, so we know the barriers and the challenges that our businesses face, and we know how to build bridges to make sure that those businesses have the relationships with the federal government. What we've got to make sure that we're doing is creating good partnerships so that everyone can win. We say that when there's a strong America, there's a strong Black America. And when there's a strong Black America, we have strong Black businesses, and we all win when that happens.
Thank you, Ron. Laurette.
Yes, and thanks also to my colleagues here. It's an honor to work with all of you. I think we have a rare opportunity right now with the investments that are available to go back and bring our best ideas. And you know what we found is an administration that's responsive. We said, look, we need to understand crop insurance. We need a new system. We need insurance adjusters that are people of color. And we talked to the head of risk management agency, and she said, let's do a training program. And can you imagine what happens if you have 5 Black crop insurance agents show up in South Carolina? That's changing the system. It's like taking all the opportunities for new jobs and making sure we're employing the youth from our communities, that we're building those businesses, including farms, you know, where we're able to share with the administration. They're listening. You know, rent versus own is not enough. We have to look at all the heirs property that's out there, which we worked with former Congressperson and now HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. And so we have ideas, and now is the time to sign up to join the advisory board, to put your best ideas forward, to participate on the calls, and to go after the resources, to show up, to join the boards and committees, because we are the government, and that's the thing that's going to change and activate our rural communities to build a future for our ecosystem and for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurette. Marlene?
So for me, the call of action is for our community to keep doing what they do best, right? To educate those in the federal government to ensure that our needs are being heard and that they're being met, as we are doing call of action across all disciplines to make sure that people with disabilities are at the table and by your side, step by step. to ensure that we're all working together for social justice and for the civil rights of all citizens in the United States. And I mean citizens meaning the folks who live here and not just those that were born here.
Thank you very much, Marlene. And thank you all, Marlene, Laurette, and Ron, for your inspiring words and your partnership with the administration. Appreciate your being on this panel. So today we've heard from leaders across the Biden-Harris administration and advocates who are working day in and day out to build a more equitable nation. In spite of the historic progress we've made to deliver for the American people, underserved communities, including communities of color, LGBTQI+ individuals, people who live in rural communities, tribal communities, people with disabilities, women and girls, and communities impacted by persistent poverty, continue to face unacceptable barriers, and it's the responsibility of the government to address those barriers. By signing this new executive order on equity, the president has strengthened the federal government's commitment to ensuring that the promise of America is a promise for everyone. And importantly, this strengthened commitment also reflects the attention to the reality that some individuals experience discrimination based on multiple factors and are particularly underserved. We encourage everyone to learn more about the administration's commitment to equity by visiting whitehouse.gov/equity. Thank you for attending today's briefing, and have a great day.